Hi, I'm David Harmon, and this is my partner Keith Cook. We are real estate brokers with RE/MAX in Bellingham, Washington.
On our website, a lot of people were searching real estate terms, so this video specifically, this series will be for real estate glossary or lingo or terms that realtors or brokers are using in real estate. So hopefully you like it. We are brokers. The end result is what we're hoping for, is that people like what we have to say. They want to list their property for sale or help them find a property to buy. So check it out, like, subscribe, and hope you enjoy. Settlement. In real estate, there's kind of two definitions for settlement. The easiest one is closing. So when you're going to close a transaction, the settlement date closing. The second one is kind of more legally, which is an agreement between the parties to a civil lawsuit in which the plaintiffs agree to drop the suit in exchange for money, or the defendants promise to do or refrain from doing something. I like the first one better because that means we're doing a sale and we get to the settlement, which is closing. So if you're going to purchase a property, usually there's going to be a closing date, and on that closing date, we're going to deal with an escrow company. That'll be the settlement date. And when everything's settled, the transaction's settled, so it becomes the buyer's property on that day, and the buyer gets the property, the seller gets the money. The other stuff on settlement, we don't really run into that much, but if we will run into neighbors that get mad at each other, and if they settle, then they just agree to either financial damages or someone agrees not to do something anymore to a property. Stick with the first one with the buying real estate. That's our specialty.
Short plat, the subdivision of a parcel of land into 4 or fewer lots.
Short platting is involved in a lot of different properties, either short platting or long platting. The long plats are 5 or more, short plats are 4 or less. The benefit is that you can, buy 1 and sell 4. So if you buy a 20-acre parcel, you go through the division process, you've created 4 parcels. Now you can potentially make a little bit more money because someone will pay more for a smaller piece per square foot than they would a larger piece. So there is a way to develop it and make some money, whether you wanted to make money or just say it was a family adventure. So if you had 4 people that wanted to go in and they all wanted to build their own home, you could want to buy a larger piece of property that was dividable, and then you would all have your own home right there. There's a lot of requirements for going through the platting, short plat, long plat process, and we can kind of get into that in detail later, but it's pretty expensive. It could take a year or 2. There's a lot of required documentation. It's a lot of research to look at it. So if you are looking at a property you think that could be divided or platted, we're happy to take a look at it and give you our 2 cents worth as well.
Short sale, selling a home for less than the amount owed with the lender's consent. The lender receives the sale proceeds and typically releases the borrower from the remaining debt.
These were prominent a few years ago, and hopefully they're not going to be prominent again. I think short sales have been around as soon as they started lending money. There's been some form of a short sale. And basically it is that, say you owe $100,000 on a property and it's only worth 80. So what do? Either if you don't have the 20 grand extra to pay for it, you can either give it up for foreclosure, just say I'm moving on, and that goes to the bank. And the bank's like, we don't want this property because we're gonna have to take care of it, manage it, and have it. It's our portfolio. We don't want to own it. We just want the money. So the bank may say, all right, if you go through this whole process and you basically reverse qualify, like instead of qualifying to purchase it, you have to qualify to unpurchase. If you go through that process, the bank may accept less if you qualify, and instead of getting 80 grand, maybe they get 70 grand, but it saved them that whole headache of owning the property. If you're looking at a short sale, either buying or selling it, it's way more than what a little video can do right here, because there's all different types of strategies and negotiations and tactics. And I'm certified with all of that stuff to go through and negotiate. So if you're interested, give us a shout and we can go to that more in detail for your specific situation. Or if you just have questions in general, I think we love talking real estate and we'll go over any of that as well. What is signing at escrow? An occurrence once an escrow officer has received all the lender documents and has prepared the settlement statement, deed, and related paperwork. Essentially how that works in the real world is there'll be a purchase and sale agreement, there will be a closing date. Generally, the buyer and the seller will make arrangements to sign with the escrow officer a few days before the closing date and have the paperwork notarized and recorded and distributed. But basically, signing with escrow is one of the last processes in completing a purchase and sale agreement.
Special assessment. A tax levied only against the properties that have benefited from the public improvements, such as a sewer or a street light. To cover the cost of improvements creates a special assessment lien.
And not necessarily special in a good way, but it's, I guess, special. It's not a normal assessment. So if you were going to do something that improves your property, condos, I think, would get special assessments, condominiums, more often than any other type of property because they're all having the same common area. So if you have a common clubhouse and you're going to put in a new pool or re-roof it or paint the units, then everyone pays their fair share. But it might be that you have a property, say they're going to improve your raw land, and so they put a traffic light in or a traffic circle or water, sewer, utilities come through there making your property more valuable. You may not be tying into it right away, but you kind of have to pay your fair share. A cool part also with the special assessments are not everyone necessarily has all the money to do everything at the same time. So if you're dealing with something like the water district and they're wanting to extend the lines, there's sometimes you can get a payment plan. So, or if they're putting the traffic circle, you can get a payment plan. So they're not necessarily expecting everyone to have all the money up front. Now you can pay it. It would be a lien against your property. So if you were to sell the property, you would have to pay that lien amount. And that's something you can look at the situation when it pops up and just see how financially you want to deal with it. Do you want to pay it on an annual basis, or you just want to pay it all up front?
Yeah, I just went through one on a property where it was an entire neighborhood that had an upgrade to their sewer system. So there was a special assessment, and one thing to note is that the buyer of this property was in charge of assuming that, but the lender required that to be paid off. So they couldn't, it was like $30 payments, but the lender was in a position that forced that entire assessment to be paid off because they wouldn't loan, the buyer couldn't assume that. So just a note, if you're looking at property that has that, that may be something that needs more due diligence.
And that will show up on the title report. So it'd be nice to know that as early on if you're looking to buy something, but that's kind of what we do. If you're looking at something, we kind of ferret out a bunch of this information ahead of time, whether you're buying or selling. We try to get all of the information as soon as possible. How do I claim squatter rights in Washington State? These are the requirements for the claim. 1, the claim has to be hostile. 2, the squatters need to physically live in the property. 3, the occupation by the squatter needs to be evident to anyone. 4, the trespassers has to possess the property exclusively. And 5, the squatter has to live on the property for 7 contiguous years.
I think that's probably a pretty valid topic nowadays, given the situations that we're dealing with the homeless population.
Well, I was just looking at that because our next word was quiet title action. So just looking at what can happen. And so there's a variety of ways that people can take property. Adverse possession is kind of what it is, where you can just take the property. Usually with adverse possession, it's if you're taking the neighboring property. With squatter rights, I haven't run into it yet, but it is out there and it is a thing.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, like you said, it varies, because sometimes people have a neighbor's property that they're, trying to claim adverse possession on because of the use that they've had. But then there's also, you say the squatter rights, which is a whole different topic.
Squatter doesn't sound very good. Anyways, it's a thing. So if this is outside of our jurisdiction, as far as we're brokers, we're, like I like to say, fluff and marketing. If you feel you have a squatter's right or adverse possession, we're a good resource, an initial resource, but we're not the ones to get it to the finish line.
Subcontractor. A contractor who is at the request of the general contractor provides a specific service such as plumbing or drywalling in connection with the overall construction project.
There's a huge benefit in working with subcontractors. So let's just say you're going to build a house. You're going to hire a general contractor, and they're going to mostly probably be doing the framing and some of the finish work, but they're not going to have an expertise. And there's so many different levels of what it takes to build a house. You know, paint, sheetrock, flooring, cabinets, windows, trim, roofing, plumbing, electric, heating, air conditioning, concrete. There's just so much. So you can't expect one general to have knowledge in all of these. They're going to have a working knowledge of all of them, but one person's not going to build the entire home. So they're going to hire a subcontractor who specializes in each one of those little areas. So whether you're building a home or doing a remodel and you still have different tradespeople coming through, each tradesperson that's coming through working on the property would be referred to as a subcontractor working under the general contractor.
Subject 2. When a purchaser takes property subject to a trust deed or a mortgage, she is not personally liable for paying off the loan. In case of default, however, the property can still be foreclosed on.
So with this subject 2, I'd almost say I would have two definitions of this subject 2. This financial one that Dave just explained, which we don't really run into that much or at all residentially. It has to deal, I think, more with commercial type loans and loans that were taken out probably like 50 years ago, because the current loans residentially are going to have a provision in there called a due on sale clause. And what that's going to mean, that mortgage is going to reference that if title is transferred to this property, that loan needs to be paid in full. What I think of more currently a subject to would be like a contingency, saying, all right, I'll buy the property subject to or contingent upon something happening. So I may buy your property subject to an inspection. If I don't like the inspection, I'm not going to buy it. So our subject twos could be an inspection, a well inspection, septic inspection, lead-based paint inspection. It could be on financing, could be on a feasibility or due diligence on land or getting a short plat. So a subject to is basically not necessarily a completed sale or a transaction that's ready to close. A buyer's going to say they're going to purchase it, but a few things need to happen first. So each property is different, each situation is different, buying, selling, the situation. So subject to, in my mind, is going to mean that you're going to have some type of contingency in order to complete the sale.
Subordination Clause, a provision in the mortgage or a deed of trust that permits a later mortgage or deed of trust to have higher lien priority than the other containing the clause.
So I actually used to help kind of teach a class on this down in Seattle. It's what actually got me started with a lot of investors. So I was working with a retired broker and a retired loan officer, and they were looking for all these fixer-upper properties. So we found those, and some of them weren't financeable, and we were working with private money to lend on them. But those private lenders wanted to be in first position. So if we came in and say someone wanted a house, say fictitious number $100,000, we could say, all right, we'll give you the $100,000, but here's how we want to do it. We want to give you $60,000 down, and then you carry $40,000 in an IOU. In this case, the guys we're working with would actually borrow the $60,000, so that would be in first position, and the seller's equity would be $40,000 in second position. So if something was to happen to that property, the seller would be in a little bit of a disadvantage dealing with that first mortgage. And they're just kind of tricky. You want to be aware, because some of these situations could have been set up for default, to make sure they default on the $60,000 and they foreclose. So these are situations I would highly want to double check and make sure the equity and the credibility of all parties involved. So if you're put in a situation residentially with the subordination agreement, I'd want to check it out. Commercially, like on leases and stuff, tenants are going to subordinate to new loans, and owners, and it's a different situation if you're dealing commercially with a subordination. But residentially, call us if this comes up with your situation, because they are risky. Subprime mortgage. A mortgage loan made to a borrower who doesn't meet the requirements for ordinary mortgage loans because of problems with credit or financial qualifications or lack of documentation. The interest rate and fees of these mortgages are usually higher to offset the added risks to the lender.
Subprime mortgage, was definitely a big issue back in 2008 when the lenders in the secondary market basically would give loans out to people that didn't actually qualify. So there was no income verification, just kind of a radical step towards getting people into homes with mortgages that weren't really secured by any income at all. So right now we're seeing that has been adjusted by modifications in the lending requirements, making it a lot more difficult for those people to do it. There is still a market there for that secondary, a little bit higher interest rate, but there's still availability. But basically our real estate market and the mortgage industry is not based on that secondary market like it was back in the early 2000s. Survey, the process of precisely measuring the boundaries and determining the area of a parcel of land.
Surveys are a big part of real estate. People need to know where their property is. And so most people don't necessarily go hire a surveyor if they're buying an existing home, because they kind of just assume where the property lines are. If you want to know exactly where your property line is, then you would hire a survey and they'll come out and let you know exactly where it is. If you are going to develop property, you want to know exactly where these new homes are going to go if you're putting in 20 homes. So surveyor comes out and identifies where each lot should be. There's a few different ways they have to help establish that. But at the end of the day, the surveyor has an engineering stamps the survey, and it should be recorded on the property and make sure it's public knowledge so everyone else knows that is the true location of those properties.
Tax-Deferred Exchange, a transaction in which a piece of property held for investment or used in a trade or a business is traded for a piece of a like-kind property, thus deferring the tax on the gain, sometimes called a tax-free exchange or a 1031 exchange.
So it's, IRC, Internal Revenue Code 1031. There's other codes, 1032 if your property burns down or replacement, but 1031 is the most common one, and that deals with someone selling an investment property who would like to replace it with a different investment property. So for some reason, if you wanted to sell a duplex in Bellingham and buy a single family home in Phoenix, then that could be a 1031 because it's an investment property. There's some criteria to go through. The main one is that you have 45 days to identify which replacement property you want to purchase from the date of closing. So you sell the Bellingham duplex, you have 45 days to identify the Phoenix property. The other main criteria is you have 180 days from the sale of your first leg of the property, your Bellingham property, to the second leg being the Phoenix property, to close on it. So you have 6 months to close on it. Now the rules are changing on 1031s, and depending on which political party is in charge, there's different feelings about this. It's been around for years and years, been around for 40 years or so. And I'm not sure how long it's going to last. So if it is something you're looking at doing, you may want to check. I'm not sure how up to date this video will be in the future. There may not be 1031. So if it is something you're interested in trading a property for a different property, it's worth checking out. If you have one property like to trade for another one, we're happy to, from this end of it, tell you what's going on in the Bellingham area.
Tenant, someone in a lawful possession of real property, someone who has leased property from the owner.
Tenant, I think it kind of is self-explanatory. Another term may be a renter or a lessee if you're actually looking at how it's written on a contract. Pretty easy one. I think a lot of people end up being a tenant one way or the other. Even if you're like to stay in a hotel room, you're kind of a tenant for a night. There's different rules and stuff, but a tenant, it's a good way of of actually having housing if you're moving to an area and you're not sure if you want to live in the area or not, because it's expensive to buy and it's expensive to sell. So if you were to rent, I think renting for a period of time to establish what neighborhood you like, or making sure you like the city and the area. So it's not a bad way to go on, pretty easy term, but there are some benefits of being a tenant for sure.
Term. A prescribed period of time, especially the length of time a borrower has to pay off a loan or the duration of a lease. So term, we'll see that mostly in real estate as either in a lease or maybe in your mortgage. So you might have like a 15-year term loan, you might have a 30-year term, and in a lease, you can have anywhere from month to month or 5 years. It's just basically a time frame. Everything when it comes to leases or mortgages would have some type of a term. Third party, a person seeking to deal with a principal through an agent, or in a transaction, someone who is not one of the principals.
Practically in real estate, where third party may come into play is, let's pretend I'm a buyer and you're a seller. We're going to hire a escrow company to close our transaction. That's a third party. So that is someone who is a third party to you and I helping. And where it gets confusing is that third party can be used in a lot of different situations. I think, like if you're gonna go buy a car and it's just, you're gonna go and you're dealing with the salesperson, you may reference the third party, which may be your spouse, and that's not part of the situation. So there's a reference of a third party. So it's a third, I wouldn't necessarily say neutral party, but it's a third party to the agreement that may or may not be there at the time.
Time is of the essence. A clause in a contract that means performance on the exact date specified in an essential element of the contract. Failure to perform on time is a material breach.
I think essentially it means that all parties are trying to do their best to meet the closing requirements for the time frames involved. They can't always be met, and if someone is in breach, that's a tough situation, because we've run into situations through some fault, no fault of the seller, the buyer wasn't able to make a closing on time. And depending on how the contract's written, the seller's not obligated to extend the contract. And we'll run into this more with kind of online lenders who don't really seem to have as much interest as the closing date. So local lenders will make sure we're going to make closing on time. The online lenders, I think we have a bigger chance of them asking for a closing date extension, which kills me because they're putting that borrower in jeopardy to not get the property because they didn't get their ducks in a row in time. So a big disadvantage for going with an online lender is time is of the essence. I don't see the online lenders having much of an interest in that. But for the most part, yeah, everyone's trying to say May 5th is the closing date. Everyone's trying to go for May 5th and make it happen. Timeshare, an interest in a condominium unit that entitles a holder to occupy the unit during a specific time slot or number of days every year. We have a few local timeshares, and I've stayed in some timeshares. I think in theory they're pretty cool. I think some people call them like fractional, or what you're going to have on your percentage of ownership. Kind of a forced vacation spot. The ones we have locally are cool spots. They're nice destinations. I think what people get caught up in is the monthly dues or the annual dues and the credits. And they work right now where you may have, say, a timeshare in Birch Bay, but you can trade that timeshare to use in other places like Whistler or the Oregon coast. They're part of these clubs and points where you can trade your Birch Bay 1 week and you could go to Hawaii for a week. And so it's kind of a cool vacation club. It's really not real estate, and it has, I think, a bad connotation with some people who don't really like the timeshares. I think their sales tactics may be a little tough, where they get you in. It's a little bit of a pressure sales tactics to purchase them. But at the end of the day, if people are going on vacation and the timeshare is what allowed them or got them thinking about going on vacation, it makes sense to me is get out and enjoy yourself.
Title insurance. An insurance policy that indemnifies a buyer or a lender against losses resulting from title defects that have not been expected from coverage. An owner's policy protects the buyer, while a mortgage policy protects the buyer's lender. Extended coverage. Title insurance that covers problems that should be discovered in an inspection of the property. In addition to the problems covered by standard coverage policies, an extended coverage policy is sometimes referred to as an American Land Title Association or ALTA policy. Homeowners coverage. Title insurance that covers most of the title problems that our extended coverage policy covers, but protects the buyer instead of the lender. Finally, standard coverage. Title insurance that protects against latent title defects, such as forged deeds and undiscovered recorded encumbrances, but does not protect against problems that could be discovered only through inspection of the property.
And each state does it differently. I know on the East Coast they do more of a round table, like closing or escrow, but in title, it's basically a guarantee. It's a one-time guarantee that you are the actual seller of the property. You're purchasing a property that's free of encumbrances. So it may be that a buyer has say a seller has a lien. So it could be a judgment or a lien that's attached or associated with the property, or even another mortgage. If someone's going to buy the property, the title company makes sure that that title is clear of defects or clear of any claims against it. So if you buy a property, someone else can't come back a year later and say, well, the last guys didn't pay us for this. You've got a title policy for that. So it's something that in Washington State, the seller will provide the buyer with a copy of a title policy if you're using our standard multiple listing forms. Typically, if a buyer is going to obtain a loan, their lender will require an additionally insured, so their loan is insured as well. But if it's a cash sale, the only person who has to pay title is the seller, but the buyer will pay if there's a loan involved. It's kind of complicated. You'll get a big report, and there's a lot of information in the policy dealing with copies of each easements. Because for the most part, like, you can own a piece of property, and then there can be like an easement that's recorded against it, or it could be part of a homeowner association. So each document that this property is obligated to, you'll get a copy of each of those. So it's a good read, kind of interesting, and super important for helping us clear to make sure, because I'm not going to give you $1 million for a property, right, and it's not your property, so you'll know it's yours.
And we can help guide through some of the stuff, but working with a strong escrow title company, they actually have the professionals on the inside that can really uncover and really dissect everything that's on there and make it a little bit easier for you to understand. And their job is to protect you as well. So they're going to look through all those documents and make sure that they're protected.
For the most part, I would say in 99.9% of the transactions we're involved with, the title company's involved that will provide a title insurance policy. The less than 1% of a chance is if private parties are transferring property individually, and that's used by a quitclaim deed. We use title companies and escrow companies quite a bit. The initial part, what they do is a title search, which is an inspection of the public records to determine all rights and encumbrances affecting the title to a piece of property. After they do that, they'll create a title report. Technically, it's a report issued by the title company disclosing the conditions of the title to a specific piece of property before the actual title insurance policy is issued. And then we end up with what is marketable title free and clear of objectable liens, encumbrances, defects, so that a reasonable, prudent person with full knowledge of the facts would not hesitate to purchase the property. So in a nutshell, there's things that are recorded against the property, and some will go away to transfer and some won't. So if you're buying a property from someone who has a mortgage on it, when you purchase it, that mortgage is paid off, and that's insured that that's paid off. But if there's things like you live in a neighborhood and there's conditions, covenants, and restrictions, or easements, basically every document that's recorded against the property will show up in your title report to let you know what all you're getting into with that piece of property. Title. What is title in real estate? I would consider it similar to like a deed, but it actually shows ownership of the property. So if you have the title or the deed to a property, you would own it. Just like in the old Westerns, when someone pulls out the deed, you say, I own it. you own it. It's important to have those recorded with the county of record, because that's going to make notice to everyone else that that's your property. If it's not recorded, someone else may come and scoop it away from you. So make sure to record it.
Township. In a government survey system, a parcel of land 6 miles square containing 36 sections, the intersections of range and township tier.
It's actually pretty cool. So each parcel number we're Whatcom County, and most counties are similar, I would imagine, but you end up with, usually it's a 12-digit number, and it'll go to add 4 if it's a condominium, but usually they'll end in all zeros. But the first 6 numbers are the section, township, and range. So you'll take the entire county, and then you'll go like section 37 or section 38. So you end up with a 6 mile by 6 mile graph, and then it'll go through what your section is, your township, and your range. So you can kind of tell if your area section 37 north, township, where you're at. So you can, the title companies, it's crazy when if we call them and give them a couple of the numbers, they can pinpoint it just right off the bat with the first 6 numbers, because they know right where it's at. So it's just another way of identifying the general location of a property, and this will be part of your tax parcel number that will identify your individual piece of property. So that's kind of started with the section, township, and range. Trade fixtures. Articles of personal property annexed to real property by a tenant for use in trade or business, which the tenant is allowed to remove at the end of the lease.
Yeah, I think lots of times we'll see this mostly in like commercial applications with businesses that people have certain items that are specific to what their business needs are. So it wouldn't be included in the purchase of that acquisition.
And sometimes if there's improvement, sometimes they have to stay with the property and sometimes not. So if you're, say, a restaurant and you put in a hood, then that hood's gonna stay with the property because that's affixed to the property. But if you have some freestanding like cash registers or shelving or things that are freely movable, then you'll be able to take those with you. Residentially, kind of similarly, is look at the contract to see what's included or not, because sometimes owners and buyers have a difference of opinion. So if it's like a swing set or a garden shed or curtains or TVs, or it's not always included, appliances, washers, dryers. So double check your contract and make sure you know what you're getting.
Trust, a legal arrangement in which title to a property or the funds is vested in one or more trustees who manage the property on behalf of the trust beneficiaries, in accordance with instructions set forth in the documents establishing the trust.
There's a lot of different types of trust. So this is something that we deal with a lot as brokers, how people will take title, or if they own a property, how they want to hold it. So instead of holding it in David Harmon, you might hold it in the David Harmon Trust. And then other people you can have other people help manage it. There's going to be information in the trust as far as what happens when you pass away, what happens to the trust. Sometimes there's people who are incapacitated and they want it in a trust. Sometimes people have a living trust. So there's different ways to hold ownership of property. Sometimes you might do it in a corporation or an LLC. So it's not always just in your own name. Some of the like corporations or LLCs, it actually creates like a separate entity. So if you had, say, 100 rentals and you owned them individually, someone sues you on one, now they can actually go after the other 99 as well. So sometimes people will put it in an LLC. So each property or a group of properties is an LLC. So if someone was going to sue you over one property, they can only go after that one property, say, not the other 99. So kind of technical term, we can get into it more later and help guide what may work best for you, but it's a clever way to protect yourself. And with the trust, it's a clever way to make sure that when you do pass away, it's kind of similar to a will in some aspects, that you're going to lay the groundwork for what's going to happen down the road when you pass away.
Trustees Sale, a non-judicial foreclosure sale under a deed of trust.
So Washington is a non-judicial state, which means you don't really have to go to court in order to take a property away. So essentially what happens, how do you get to a trustee sale? you have a note and deed of trust with either a lender or a private individual, and you've made arrangements, say, to get a 30-year mortgage, and sometime during the life of that, you stop making payments or you're in breach of that contract. What can happen, instead of going, to court, the party that's damaged can actually go non-judicially through a procedure to take the property back. And usually that's going to take 6 months or so. That's something an attorney will help you with. But basically, at the end of it, you're going to get, and there's a process to go through. It's a pretty heavy-duty process. You're going to get a notice. You're going to get lots of different papers. It's going to be filed. Other people will become aware of the default, and at the end of it, say 6 months later, you've missed the payments, you're going to lose the property. It goes up for auction, and what's going to happen with that auction is going to be a trustees sale. A lot of times those are handled at the courthouse, some of them more with the internet and stuff, some of them are happening online. But it's an opportunity for the party who has the money owed to them to demand the money. The property is put up for auction, and one of two things are going to usually happen at the auction. Either someone's going to come and bid at the amount to cure it. So let's just say the mortgage amount is $100,000. The party owed the $100,000 is generally going to start the bid out at $100,000. So unless someone else bids more than that, they're actually at the end of the foreclosure or the auction going to get the property back. If it goes more than that and someone bids $101,000, the party who's owed the $100,000 gets their $100,000, and the party that bid $101 now is the property owner. So a little complicated, a little tricky with title insurance or checking these out, but it's generally an opportunity for investors to get actually a fairly decent deal on a property. It's kind of where like HUD homes, or the way a HUD home fits into this is if property went through the foreclosure process, but that was a loan backed by FHA, and then it becomes a HUD home. And those are usually lower down payment, so people have less equity. So foreclosures get pretty tricky. I actually helped do classes when I first started 30 some odd years ago, and so did quite a bit of helping people work with a group of investors. It's kind of a fun way to look for equity. So if you're an equity buyer looking for the best value or a good value on a property, a lot of times the foreclosure is a fair way to think about it. Truth in Lending Act, a federal law that requires lenders to make disclosures concerning loan costs to consumer loan applicants, and that also requires certain disclosures in advertising concerning consumer credit. And this is actually a pretty big deal because sometimes it's like people felt they might be getting a bait and switch a little bit. So it says, oh, we're going to give you an interest rate of 5%. But what they're not telling you is there's loan origination fees, doc prep fees, review fees, all of these other fees. So usually they're going to say if it's 5%, oh, we'll give you 5%, but the actual percentage rate is like 5 3/4, because if you take all these extra fees, throw them into the loan and actually figure out what you're paying for, it's actually a higher number. So it's kind of cool where it lets all lenders work across the board. So consumers can look at each lender and really understand what you're paying for the loan.
Underwriting. In real estate lending, the process of evaluating a loan application to determine the probability that the applicant would repay the loan and matching the risk to an appropriate rate of return, sometimes called risk analysis.
And basically this is going to happen on every residential and commercial loan. There's going to be different ways that it's handled, but for the most part at the end, it's going to say, all right, here's the buyer, they want to buy this house, here's the buyer's down payment, their credit, the appraisal, the condition, the whole contract, and basically look at everything and say, all right, does this make sense for us? Commercially, it can be done by committee. It takes a little longer. Residentially, it's just through a process. So it's basically at the end, when the loan is all put together, it's underwritten, and then that's almost the final step before closing, because once it's underwritten, they're saying, okay, the loan is 100% good to go. Get the paperwork off to the parties to close it, the escrow company, and that's what helps finalize the transaction in the properties that are being sold with the loan.
Undue influence. Exerting excessive pressure on someone as to overpower the person's free will and prevent him or her from making a rational or prudent decision often involves abusing a relationship of trust.
And we didn't know about throwing this one in here or not, but it is kind of, I guess, tough from our standpoint on working with people, and it's like being passionate and trying to help people really make the best decision possible. So at least for us, we don't try to use undue pressure, but we do try to be realistic and let people know, the pros and the cons, and not to like over-represent someone. So like we might be in a multiple offer situation, and in those situations, buyers may need to make more risks. And knowing that if you come in and you've got 10 contingencies on inspections and financing and well and septic and attorney and title and just having everything checked out, we're representing you writing that on a contract, but did that help you get the property when you're competing with other, cash or non-contingent offers? So it's really a fine line, and looking at each property, each situation differently. From a seller standpoint, we try to get the best amount we can for a seller. And sometimes we're in situations where it's worth, say it's worth $10 and the sellers want $11 or $12 for that property. And that makes it tough for us because sure, we'd like to get you as much money as possible, but are we really representing you just kind of going down with your path of trying to get more than what it's worth? And so we're kind of unrepresenting you on that. So I guess it's I don't really run into it with undue influence. I think sometimes it may come down to if people are desperate and interest rates, or sometimes you end up and make a decision that you didn't want to make. But I think for the most part, we treat everything as above board and as fair as possible. We're licensed, so if we're not being fair, we're putting our license online every transaction we do. And some brokers lose their licenses, so we're pretty sincere with that. But it is something that's out there, and it is a term, and so that's our definition. We can chat later if you want to go into strategies, because there's each property is a different strategy on how to put a transaction together. VA is the Department of Veterans Affairs, and how that comes into real estate is the VA has a certain type of loan for prior military service personnel. And it's actually probably one of the better loans you can get out there. There's different requirements with it. With your certificate of eligibility, you'll have to provide your DD 214 when you exited the military. But in general, I think it's one of the more solid loans. I'm a vet. I've used my VA loan several times. There are requirements when you use it a few more times, but it's one of the better loans out there in my opinion, because you can actually come in with no money down, or 100% cash refinance, or there's just different requirements with this loan and features and benefits that you're not going to find in some of the other loans. So if you are a vet, it's worth looking into obtaining this type of finance. And I think most vets are aware of this. It's just a matter of trying to pull the trigger and see if something works for you. Variable interest rate. A loan interest rate that can be adjusted periodically during the loan term, as in the case of an adjustable rate mortgage.
Yeah, the adjustable rate or the variable rate mortgage is definitely a tool that can be used given what the buyer's needs are during the time. Maybe they think that the interest rates are going to go down in the future, so they don't want to be locked into a certain interest rate. So it's definitely beneficial.
It depends on your situation, how long you're going to hold the property, what you think the rates are going up or down right now. So right now we're in a position where rates were going down, so people were more likely to use the adjustable rate mortgage because there wasn't the fear of it going up and locking into a 30-year loan. So if you lock in for 30 years, you're gonna have the same interest rate for 30 years. And I guess it's a bit more of a gamble if you're gonna go with the adjustable rate mortgage, because you don't know what that rate's gonna be for the whole time. This is something to get in more to with the lender, and we can chime in on this as well, but there's different indexes which are going to say, like, was it prime or the LIBOR or other costs of funds, as far as figuring out what your rate is going to be for the remainder balance of the loan. And it might be fixed for a couple years and then adjust, and then it might change annually, or there's just a lot of different things that'll come in on an adjustable rate. Most HELOCs, the home equity line of credits, are going to be adjustable because you might have some money set aside that you can borrow at any time, but once you borrow it, then that's going to set the price. So it's borrowing money. It comes into real estate, so it's a great tool to have if that's the type of borrower you are.
Variance. Permission to use the property or build a structure in a way that violates the zoning ordinance in a relatively minor way.
And there's a lot of rules that the city and county are going to have jurisdiction. So it could be something as simple as you've got a 10-foot setback on your side yard and you want to build to within 5 feet of it. You'd go through the process of the correct departments, and then they would actually give you permission to build to the 5 feet. There's a lot of different ways you can go through to kind of amend the rules a little bit for each specific property. So if you have any questions specifically, if you can or can't do something on a piece of property, we're happy to help research it from our end and see what we can do to lend a hand. Will, a person's stipulation regarding how their estate should be disposed of after they die, also called a testament. So the will, if you're thinking about the will, you're thinking about a variety of things. One, what's going to happen if you pass away? So for the most part, the will is going to help establish where your stuff goes. Usually this is going to be prepared by an attorney, which I would recommend. But there's also some things that you can do, like having a directive or having a power of attorney set up. So in the event that you're incapacitated, someone can step in and act on your behalf. So I think estate planning is pretty huge. It's a big deal. We're all going to pass away. We can't avoid it. So let's, put your ducks in a row. So if you're incapacitated or in the hospital, who's going to help look after your stuff? And eventually when you do pass away, where does your stuff go? So I think put your big kid pants on and get a will. I can't tell you how many people we run into that don't have these, but it's definitely in your best interest.
Yeah, having a will lets you control what happens to your assets when you pass away, because without the will, it may end up going to somebody that you don't want it to go to because you didn't have the prudence to sit down and plan where you wanted your assets to go to. So it may be against your will after you pass away, and your heirs may have questioned why they didn't get something, but that was up to the state to make those decisions because you didn't have a will.
Yeah, and there's a better chance that the state's going to get some more money. You're going to eat up attorney's fees, kind of arguing and stuff like that. So it's pretty easy. Just set it up. Where's your stuff go? And that's where it goes. Zoning, government regulation to the use of property within specific areas.
Yeah, zoning is kind of a fun topic because it can really vary from individual property to individual property. So you may have a piece of property that may be zoned R5, but it may, if you look at the actual zoning of it, you may be able to put 4 houses on it, or may have a cluster short plat. And in the city of Bellingham, we have different zoning issues right now going on with the infill toolkit, where the city wants a lot of infill, so they're allowing some higher density in certain areas. So it's definitely a fun topic. We do have kind of a team of people that we work with, whether it's a land use consultant or planners or Whatcom County, that helps jump through the hoops and the different process of dealing with zoning in Whatcom County.
And for the most part, I agree 100%. And it's kind of rules and regulations for each type of zoning. So if you're going to buy in a residential area, you're going to expect to be around other residential neighborhoods. But sometimes residential may touch commercial or light industrial or something. So I wouldn't assume anything on a piece of property what the zoning is unless it's researched a little further. But the nice thing is, if you're in the center of a residential area and you've got homes, 100 each direction, you could make the assumption, but still double check that they don't end up putting a 7-Eleven on the property next door, because maybe that piece next door is zoned small town commercial and they can do something a little bit different. So the zoning is basically the rules to play by on as far as how you can develop a piece of property or not.